Just a quick intro to the video that I want to share today. I interviewed a gentleman by the name of Jett 2 years ago. And before I wanted to put out the video that I made with him, I wanted to actually read his book. And you'll see that it's a book. um, and it takes time to get through. And there's tons of footnotes that you can continue to dig deeper on. And anyway, so I'm just now getting around to putting the interview out. But very interesting life that he has had, and he was just a person that was in the right place at the right time with the right mind and the right drive. And he took the time to put all this material together. And so it's a historical book, and I just like to share information that you may find useful or not. It's completely up to you what you do with it and how you might use it. Anyway, with no further ado, here's Jett. Thank you.
All right. Well, I want to welcome my guest, Jett. He caught my attention via a colleague of mine, James Nethery, who brought the book that Wayne has there in the foreground there, the Fruits of Graft that he's written. And it's intriguing to me as a student, and always wanting to learn more truth. I'm 65 years old, and I've come to a point in my life where I know that there's many things that are presented in life, and eventually I find out that that's not necessarily true. And I recently came across something that has changed my life when I found out the truth. And so this book was extremely intriguing to me. James and Wayne did a 6-part series on the book, which maybe someday Wayne and I can revisit that ourselves. But I wanted to introduce Wayne, and we'll talk about his book. And I take this on as a student of truth. If I keep true to my own heart, that's what I want to do. So I'm here as a student, and thank you for being here, Wayne.
Good to be here.
And I would, I guess I'd like to start off as we did yesterday in our short chat, about how it was that you came to this, because you had mentioned yesterday that you became an engineer and a lawyer. And so if you would be so kind as to share that story with us, I think that's a good place to start.
Well, I came out of a small town high school in Oklahoma, East Central Oklahoma, and went to OU. By my second year, well, first year, I might as well say, I sold Cokes and so forth, soft drinks in the OU football game stadium, and also carried interdepartment mail around campus as a way of earning a little extra money. And I had been fortunate enough to get a little scholarship money, and so very happy to be there. That was my freshman year. You're not allowed to get into the college of your choice. Everyone's in the same university college. And I got into engineering my second year. of course, that was my aim in the first place, but I was fortunate enough for my excellent schooling in my small town. I was in honors English, even though I was an engineering major. And so my studies there were very good. My first semester of the second year, I got my permanent engineering college counselor. And after my first interview with him, and when I told him that I expected to do his joint curriculum in engineering and law, his comment to me was that, well, then you won't finish engineering. You'll just finish your junior year and go on to college. There's no reason to stay around for your degree. I said, no, I'm going to get my engineering degree too. I'm certainly not going to work that hard and get nothing for it, because engineering is a very demanding curriculum there, mathematics and science and so forth and so on. And I have the impression that that conversation somehow caught his attention, because that gentleman was not only the chairman of the Department of Chemical Engineering in the engineering college, he was also an important researcher at the Research Institute at OU. And a few weeks after I had that first conference with him, I had a call from his office saying that that I had an appointment with the assistant vice president, or the executive vice president of the Research Institute for a job there. And let me tell you, from the zoology room of my second semester as a freshman to the Research Institute was a major step up. Let me put it that way. And I had a tremendous time and very useful education from the Research Institute. I was tutored and taught to be a technical writer, to write proposals for contracts and grants from government and from other organizations and so forth. I had a terrific supervisor who was Ralph C. Martin, was the chief editor of the technical writing department. And in that circumstance, I became an effective person in terms of writing grant proposals to get money from the government or from other organizations during the time that I was studying engineering. So my education really broadened by having that very practical kind of thing, and it led me later. I left the technical research writing and went on to a special project that had been granted because of a proposal I had written. And to kind of jump ahead, that was about the time that I was ready to start my law school education. I was a senior at the time. And in those circumstances, I became fully employed at the same time I was going to law school at what was then called the Office of Special Projects of the Continuing Education Center. And that led me promptly to a trip to Washington, D.C. for a couple of weeks to basically visit the various congressional offices right after Lyndon Johnson was elected president. And the Great Society was ongoing with, all kind of money and so forth. So I started getting education of that kind at the same time I was in law school. And we had the Bay of Pigs and the Kennedy assassination. All of that was when I was in law school, a very turbulent time and a very educational time. But to make it long, to just cut to the chase, while still at school, at the university, I became first the assistant director, and then of the Office of Special Projects, and then the director of the, I renamed it when the man who hired me left to go to a higher paid job in New York. And I became the director of the Office of Advanced Studies, which was a really innovative, the man who left had been the one who designed it, but it was a program to educate people who were already employed in places like NASA and the Strategic Air Command of the U.S. Air Force and the Army and so forth and so on. All those people were enrolling in this program to get a Master of Arts program in public administration. I was involved in spreading that into economics and to business administration and things of that sort at the time I decided to leave and I go practice law in California. But it was a very, very educational process, because while I was still at the university, I had traveled to Europe, to Germany, and to Great Britain. I had offices in both of those places. Our program educated people in those locations. I visited the commanding general of the Strategic Air Command at Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska, met with him in his underground command post. It was really a remarkable experience that I had while I was still at the university.
And still very young.
Yes, and at the time I left, I married while I was still there. As a matter of fact, we had our first son while I was still there at Norman. But then I decided that my professional career needed to happen. And frankly, I couldn't find a job as a lawyer in Oklahoma, that at least to my liking. And so I went to Los Angeles, where I was offered a position and in a field that I wanted to practice in, labor relations. And within 2 years, I had my own law firm with substantial clients. I split off from the one that I had joined. And so I look back at it, and it was really amazing, the kind of breaks that I had and advantages of being able to see the way things operate and the way things work. And over a period of years in that law practice, I developed the law in the federal courts relating to enforcement of collective bargaining agreements. That may sound esoteric, but it involves millions of dollars in benefits for pension and health care and training and so forth for workers under labor agreements. And up until the time I began practicing, there really wasn't a lot of law established in the courts as to how those agreements were to be enforced. Unfortunately, because of the money involved, the government got involved too, and they wound up breaking the promise of collective bargaining agreements, which was that collective bargaining agreements were to be that the union and the employer would bargain, and their agreement would be the one that's binding on them. But in '74, the Congress decided there was just too much money to be left alone in those kinds of benefit programs. And so the New York senator passed a law that basically turned that field upside down by requiring the government to guarantee benefits, so-called, but to get the money to do that, they took it out of the funds themselves and started spending it themselves. So it turned out to be a disaster for the private pension plans of the kind that I represented and the healthcare plans and so forth. And it basically was in order to get money from the well-run plans, such as the ones that I represented. They got the money from there, charging them so-called premiums for this insurance. And all the benefits went to the corrupt plans back east that had already had their money stolen by the mob. So it was a mess. And the thing that wound up going broke and bankrupt the PBGC became bankrupt. I litigated, one of the cases I litigated through the Supreme Court was a case that said that law was unconstitutional because it took money from private people who had no obligation to pay money, took that money from them and gave it to other private parties by just saying you've got to pay those private parties millions of dollars. And when you are a small business, you're a restaurant, you're a construction firm that's worked all your life to build up a firm having a dozen employees or something like that, and maybe your firm is worth $1 million or $2 million or $5 million, and all of a sudden it's gone. That's what that law did. It took the entire net worth, the entire earnings of tens of thousands of small employers across the country, and took it in and just took it to a federal agency that had no regard for them. I took that to the Supreme Court on behalf of my trustees, my clients, who both the union and the employers said we didn't agree that the employers would be liable for whatever these things actually cost based on what the government says we need in order to protect others that went broke. That was the kind of thing that was involved there, the so-called public policy. But it was basically something that just wrecked the union collective bargaining agreement process. Very, very damaging all the way around. And I took it there on the basis that it was a violation of the Fifth Amendment taking clause that says basically no person can take private property from, no law can take money from one person and give it to another. That was a decision in 1986 of the U.S. Supreme Court, unanimous decision, by the way, led by a conservative justice, so-called. Rehnquist was the Chief Justice at the time. During the oral argument in that case, only one justice asked me a question. Whizzer White, the justice from Colorado, former great football player, he actually asked a question of the other side, the PBGC's attorney, and said, you know, you're arguing that this is just like the minimum wage law. Isn't it really different what's being happened here? Because these payment obligations are not just prospective employees that you know how much you're going to have to pay. This goes back 20 years and makes you pay based on what was done back then when you had no idea about this. The attorney for the PBGC, getting that question, went right on and never said a word in response to the question. Not one word. No response to it, as if it was not even asked. And the court never asked another question of them. They wrote a unanimous decision upholding the law. They never answered my point about the taking clause of the Fifth Amendment. They didn't refer to it. They said, we've already allowed this kind of thing to happen under the due process clause. And so we certainly wouldn't have allowed it to happen under the due process clause if it were a violation of the taking clause. You know, that is absolutely complete gibberish. To see a decision like that, it was a clear message to me, hard to take, I assure you, of what we're actually have been seeing in the Supreme Court in these very recent times, in which they completely ignore the Constitution as if it does not exist. They are running the court as if they've already thrown away the Constitution. The so-called the conservative justices, just as bad as Ginsburg, saying this is an old antiquated document and I would never recommend anybody use it. if we were doing our Constitution today. Well, they don't use it now. They didn't in 1986. That is just exactly how far our constitutional rights have been. It's not just constitutional rights. The people who put it in the Constitution said these are given by God to all people. And we're going to make sure this government understands it's not empowered to take these God-given rights away. That's the basis upon which our Constitution is written and the Bill of Rights is written. And yet the full court in that case didn't raise a whimper at the fact that hundreds of thousands of families were having their entire life's work taken from them by a law passed that they had nothing to do with. There was a man, I could cut this conversation down, but I feel compelled to say one more thing about it.
Yeah, you just go right ahead.
There was a man in San Diego, small contractor, sand and gravel type supplier. I had sand and gravel property, and basically you dig gravel out of the ground and you sell it to construction projects. And he was a member of one of the employer associations, contributing into my client's trust funds for his employees. He had maybe a dozen employees, pieces of equipment to dig and, to load trucks and a few trucks and things like that. And a lawyer down there volunteered to do it free to represent him in order to be able to get to the Supreme Court and argue himself on behalf of the employers. To me, it was kind of an imposition on my time because it reduced the amount of time I had to argue. But at the same time, I can understand why the court would allow an employer representative to speak directly. But to make a long story short, that man lost his entire life's work. By the time the 3 or 4 different union pension funds that he was contractually bound to took their special payments demands from this PBGC thing, he was completely broke, lost all of his assets. He died of a ruptured stomach, ulcerated in a hospital not long after that. So this is the circumstance of a federal government out of control. I wouldn't say out of control. It is under the control of this globalist, world-based cabal that controls our government and has controlled it for quite a number of years. My book goes through that from beginning to end. It covers all of the history of our country, but particularly the 19th and 20th centuries in terms of how that cabal has made itself so powerful. By 1880, the best book on economics ever written, best-selling book on economics ever written, called War on Poverty, described all the reasons why so many severely poor people live so close proximity to the wealthiest people in the world, like in New York City. And in that entire book called Wealth and Poverty by Henry George, he has one paragraph that says there is a powerful pecuniary interest, is what he called it, that operates worldwide and writes all laws and controls all opinions in every nation of the world. And that It is so secret that Woodrow Wilson actually said, "I've found since I've become president that when powerful men speak to me, they do so in whispered tones as if something or someone is going to overhear them, and they're very concerned about their own well-being if they are heard." That's that pecuniary force that I now call the globalist cabal. Many others call it that as well. And despite the fact that that book is so well written by Henry George, it discloses all and refutes all of the theories as to why people are so poor, including Malthus, the Malthus theory that it's too many people, that birth rate's too high, all of that sort of thing. All of that is really dealt with in a magnificent way in that book. And that book, though it was self-published in 1879, it immediately became so so popular that by the next year he got a New York publisher, and in 20 years, the book sold more than 2 million copies around the world, in a number of different languages. That was before the censors of publishers, the censors of books became so much more powerful. They decided by 1901 that they had to control publishing. That's also covered in my book, and relates how they've done it. It certainly is still prevalent now. The books of their servants, you can see regularly get on New York Times bestseller list immediately. Very large amounts paid for it to the authors for their payoffs in order to get them to tell only the stories that the ruling elite want told, and to change the history that we are allowed to study and learn. So it happened that I left law practice long about the year 2000, and took up the idea that maybe I would be better off if I tried managing my assets myself. I got into that just in time to experience the tech crash, so-called, which was devastating in many respects to so many. I cover in my book that the tech crash was entirely planned. I do that after I have already shown in great detail that the Great Depression was planned and executed by this same globalist cabal, that both Hoover and Roosevelt were operatives of the globalist cabal. Roosevelt was the most effective one ever, and was so effective in manipulating public opinion, and yet inventing and doing, conceiving of ways to serve the globalist cabal in ways that even the cabal had not thought about.
Considered.
But I describe those things in detail, particularly in chapter 6 of my book, as to the actions taken by both Hoover and then, more importantly, by Roosevelt to drain money from the American economy in tremendous proportions by various actions taken primarily by Roosevelt, so that no one had any money. The actions that he took specifically not only raised taxes every year he was in, except 1939, which happened to be the year after 1938 when the Democrats lost, I think, 83 seats in the Congress, in the House, in those elections, and therefore refused to enact another tax increase the following year. By that time, the people then were calling it the Roosevelt Depression. And yet, to this day, the so-called great economists of our time, great economists of the 20th century, supposedly still regale Roosevelt as our savior of stopping the Great Depression. Roosevelt not only raised taxes every year he was in office into the World War, except 1939 when Congress wouldn't do it. He was demanding it anyway. Let me tell you just one or two of the things that he did. I have more than half a dozen major ones in chapter 6. But for example, as soon as he took office, he began buying gold on the open market using Treasury money. He bought it worldwide, and the press treated it more or less as if he was tinkering. And he said, if we get the price of gold up, it would help the economy. And that was a complete farce. I mean, you'd really have to be dense to believe that. And I don't think most people did. But here's what he was doing in much larger proportions than anyone understood. Supposedly he would just kind of dipping into this a little bit, kind of testing waters or something of the sort. In fact, he was buying prodigious amounts of gold using tax money and also selling government bonds into the private economy to suck more money out of the private economy and to put it into gold. And he brought the gold back into the Treasury and stored it and didn't allow money to be monetized as the gold standard required him to do. He had already breached the gold standard just starting doing that. And so you think, well, how much was he doing? Well, this last year, there was an article on the internet on Zero Hedge, I think it was.
Yeah.
It said,
Familiar with that.
It said, central banks of the world, this is 2020, central banks of the world are buying gold in quantities that indicate that a nuclear bomb is going to drop tomorrow. In other words, they were just buying it hand over fist in an emergency type situation and so forth. I looked at that piece and found how much they were spending, all of the central banks of the world together combined last year in 2020. In every year of the first 8 years of the Franklin Roosevelt administration, he bought more gold by himself for the U.S. Treasury using mortgage, bond money and tax money. He bought more gold by far in tonnage than all of the central banks of the world were buying at that high point of 2020.
Wow.
It was a
That's
clear design to suck the money out of the U.S. economy, to make people as poor as possible, to deflate prices, dropping them through the ceiling, that thereby bankrupting business after business after business, bankrupting farmers that couldn't sell their crops and so forth, giving license to the banks, and matter of fact, requiring banks, even in times of when the banks were not in trouble. It increased reserve requirements after he took over the Federal Reserve's control of the banks.
So would that mean that can I
increased the
interrupt?
reserve requirements so much that they had to call in loans that were even in payment status. And in two orders within about 6 months from each other in 1936 and January 37, August of 36 and January 37. They increased reserve requirements on banks across the country by 50%. That means they have to call in half their loans, whether they're in payment status or not. That was another way of forcing farmers, for example, off the land and allowing the big conglomerates to buy them up at bankrupt prices. Getting the food production out of the hands of farmers, taking the homes away from farmers, and sending them to California as penniless beggars, more or less, but looking for work. That was the kind of thing that was done throughout the Depression. I could go into many more details as I describe them specifically in chapter 6 of my book. It was an enforced by government famine to starve as many people to death as possible, as well as to destroy their livelihoods. There is no study, despite the number of social scientists, done by an American social scientist about how many people starved to death in America during those years. There are more recent, I found a Russian study, and I found a German study. I think the German study estimated at least 3 million died of starvation. The Russian study, at least 6 million died of starvation in the United States. And of course, people were dying all over the world as well as starvation. Stalin was doing the same thing, and the New York Times was covering for Stalin. The main correspondent to the New York Times from Moscow was saying that Stalin was just, if you're making an omelet, you just have to break a few eggs, don't you? That's the way he described the people starving to death in Ukraine, because they didn't want to bow down to the communist control of all the lands and food production. But they were machine gunning them, and there was some of that in the United States. So let me give you a chance to inquire. I've gone on quite a long time, and I apologize for that, but it's a subject that that gets me activated whenever I try to talk about it.
Yeah, I can